fitting him. I'm indifferent
I don't believe in God.
to the existence of
God is not judging them.
I don't have proof.
I don't know how to pray.
They're judging themselves.
You know, where is God in all of this? This is my home.
God exists.
What does it say about God that he created the orgasm?
I don't pledge allegiance to anything,
I don't pray.
only to God.
If there was a God,
And I thought,
I just have this understanding that life is hard.
he could never love me after this.
God is still good.
Welcome, everybody, to the Maybe God podcast. If you're new around here, just please subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, of course, so you can learn about all the amazing guests and new content that we have as they're being released. Today, I'm joined by a very special guest, the author of a book called Family Revision and co-founder and leader of an amazing ministry called Family Teams. His name is Jeremy Pryor. Jeremy had an epiphany over 2 decades ago, realizing that the way that families in the West are working is mostly a failed experiment, and that the scriptures, the Judeo-Christian scriptures, are calling us back to a bigger and better design for families. So, Jeremy Pryor, I'm really glad to have you here. Welcome to Maybe God.
Awesome. Eric, thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. Tell us just a little bit about yourself and your family.
Yeah. So we live in the Cincinnati area. I got 5 kids. My oldest is 23. She's got married, is expecting our first grandbaby. So we're pumped about that. So then we have my son Jackson, who lives in California right now. Sydney, who's in Norway. We're going to go visit her in a bit. She's doing a YWAM outreach there. And then Lisa and Kyra, 16 and 14.
So tell me again the ages of all 5.
23, 21. Jackson's 21. Sydney is 18. Lisa is 16, and Kyra's 14.
Okay, and you got them all over the world, sounds like. What a
Yeah, we're a little spread out right now. So we're
And what is
Yeah.
YWAM? You mentioned that.
Yeah, so that's Youth with a Mission. And so one of the things that we've wrestled with a lot actually is, how to encourage our kids as they're graduating from high school, what a next step could look like. And we've been really influenced by, particularly we've lived in Israel. And so seeing a lot of our friends, they send their kids, they have to, go into the army right after high school. And so, we kind of have encouraged our kids to do that, but kind of hit the mission field for 6 months. And so YWAM provides about 3 months of discipleship training in one of their schools, and then they send you off to a particular country. So Sydney's going to Thailand and Japan for her outreach, and then so she spent 3 months training in Norway.
Wow. So you've got all these kids that are getting older, becoming adults, and all of that. It's got to feel really, really weird, a weird season of life to be in. You don't look old enough to have a 23-year-old child. So whatever you're doing it right. Tell me about your wife.
Yeah, so April and I met in Jerusalem, and she's from Columbus. I'm from Seattle, so God really had to bring us there to meet each other. And she came from a family that goes back. They have family land in the Columbus area that goes back a couple hundred years, and so she comes from really very deep roots in that area, not too far from where we live now. And so we moved to Seattle, to Boston, and then here about 20 years ago. And so April, she stayed at home and raised our kids, and we worked together on all the businesses that we've started. So we've started a bunch of different companies together. And now she recently, about 4 years ago, she started a quilt shop just at the top of our street with her mom and our oldest daughter, Kelsey. So it's kind of like a multi-generational shop, and they do now a lot of their business online as well. So she runs that with Kelsey and her mom, and she and I then get to do a lot of other business ministry things together.
Wow, that's really cool. So you've been together how many years?
Just almost 25. We're going to celebrate our 25th wedding anniversary this May.
That's awesome. Congratulations. Tell me about your upbringing, though. Before you even met April, you were raised in the Pacific Northwest. You said, what was that like? What was your family like growing up?
Yeah. So my parents were believers. We, grew up and they were kind of from the Midwest, so they weren't super familiar with kind of the West Coast culture that obviously we encountered growing up there as kids. And as I was experiencing, I would say, family life there, this was where it was just a constant tale of broken families, and that kind of increased as I got older, just saw how much damage was being done. How like I kind of grew up in the era where the kind of the grunge thing, took off in Seattle. And there was just a ton of anger and angst, I would say. Just like, what is wrong with the world? And I definitely was influenced by just living in that, in that kind of environment. And then after going to college, I came back and spent several years doing youth ministry, mostly with public school kids in our home church, and just again saw the devastation, of how hard the family kind of their family lives were, and how predictable the brokenness was. It was extremely rare in that culture to see a functional, intact family that, and where the kids had any kind of depth of connection, meaningful connection with both parents. That was exceedingly rare. And so, even in the Christian culture that I grew up in, I feel that there was a lot of despair around family life. And so there was a movement for sure that I feel like just was almost spontaneous around just rejecting family, around maybe, do we need to get married? If we get married, do we need to have kids? And so this was the same era where Seattle became the first city in the country to have more dogs than kids. And I think just looking at the way that I saw how difficult family was, it definitely made sense. So when you think about like finding meaning in your life, when you think about belonging, there was a lot of talk about community. There was a lot of talk about friendship. There was very little optimism at all around family.
Yeah. When you look back on that time, what do you trace that back to? What was the source or the root of those sentiments about family?
Well, I think in people's individual lives, it was just their experience. But if you keep going down deeper and deeper into the roots, we're living in a sort of an experimental age where we get most of our hope, and the story that we're really leaning into culturally is one in which we are trying to become maximally expressive individualists, and so it's like if you really want to be free and experience life, the good life, then that means finding out who you are at the deepest level and having as little restriction between who you believe you authentically are and living that out in your life. And so this idea of sort of self-expressive individualism, I think, was at its real zenith it's kind of weird, what happens when you tell a mother and father that the highest expression of their life is their own self-expressive individualism, but then they start having children. What happens when the children get in the way of that pursuit in that story? And so I think that for a lot of people, they're going from relationship to relationship, discovering that maybe this marriage is not fulfilling me the way that I think it ought to. I'm just being totally unmoored culturally from any kind of norms that would cause you to think that we need to stick this out, and that we need to become a certain kind of mother or father for our children in a way that would violate what I feel is authentically me. These kinds of messages make it very difficult to say, I'm just going to embrace being a father or mother and all the responsibilities and opportunities and privileges that are created by that. And so generationally, if you keep leaning into this sort of individualism, this hyper individualism, which really I think is hitting its zenith on the West Coast of the United States, you kind of see it just has a devastating impact on family life.
So there was something about your first, or I don't know if it was your first, but it was a trip to Israel, to the Holy Land, that changed your life. Something really clicked for you, and about families. And I resonated with that because something everybody listens to, maybe God knows that something clicked for me in a really dramatic way. On my first trip to the Holy Land, I saw things that I had never seen before, and came back a Christian. But you came back from Israel in that trip with a very different view of families. Talk a little about that.
Wow. Man, I'd love to hear that story, Eric. I did have a dramatic experience. So it was very much like a setup. So, you kind of imagine, I'm 23 years old, I'm single, I'm, doing youth ministry in the Seattle area. And I'm just seeing this devastation with family, and personally really seeing my future as one in which we need to build community. We need to create a place of belonging for people. And family was the last thing on my mind as the avenue through which that would happen. And so I, even on the trip from Seattle to Jerusalem, I just kept noticing this strange scene, which was fathers and children. Even on the plane, I saw more children on the plane from New York to Jerusalem than I would normally see in the Seattle area. I lived a life that was very separate from young children, and so then getting to Jerusalem, I saw the scene play over, and I wasn't there to have a cultural experience necessarily. I was excited to learn Hebrew. I was really into kind of more the academic side of my own faith and wanted to go deeper, and that's why I wanted to spend the time there. But it sort of culminated for me when I was sitting on a bench by the old city and saw a group of fathers or men just pushing strollers with all these little kids in tow. And so it's sort of like I've seen a mommy brigade, go by before with a bunch of strollers. I'd never seen a daddy brigade before. And this was really the first time I feel like the question really sort of crystallized in my consciousness, like, what's going on here? Like, what are these guys doing? Like, don't they know that kids are annoying, that they get in the way, that they're an obstacle, that they're not, something that particularly that we as men would want? I mean, these are, of course, very deep, almost subconscious beliefs that I had adopted.
Right.
In
How
the
old were
culture
you?
that I grew up in. But this is, of course, I was 23.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's that period
this
of life.
is the danger of going to other cultures.
Right. I remember the same thing. I journaled about this when I was in the Holy Land. But I think what I observed were both Israeli and Palestinian families with a lot of these same dynamics. But I remember hearing the word Abba coming out of children's lips, off their lips, just like about their daddies, Abba, Abba. And it was, I'd learned about the word Abba from the Lord's Prayer and, other parts of Scripture where that's how Jesus referred to the Heavenly Father as Abba, this intimate word for daddy. And to hear it on the lips of children in the Holy Land, it really made an impact on me. Maybe not as profound an impact as it seems to have made on you. But what did you do with that when you started observing this? What did you do with the questions that you had?
Well, I was trying to figure out what was it that these guys believed, and why haven't they woken up to the wisdom that obviously I had discovered in all of my 23 years of wisdom, that children are really an obstacle to a fulfilling life. So as I started to talk to different Jewish and Arab dads, one of the things that was interesting they had in common when you talk to them about why they valued family, the constant reference they would make is to Abraham. And this really shocked me because I had actually just spent a semester studying under probably the top Abrahamic scholar in the country in a seminary. And we were exclusively studying Abraham and what it looks like to study the Torah through the lens of Abraham. And so I was very I was deep into this topic, but I had never once in that semester, in all of our reading and discussions and papers and books, had ever thought about Abraham as a model father. That never even occurred to me. He was the model of faith in the evangelical world, but in Jewish and Arab cult, they call him Father Abraham.
Right.
Jesus called him Father Abraham in the story of Rich Man and Lazarus.
That's right.
I mean, youth groups call him Father Abraham because there's a crazy song that
everyone knows.
You guys, if you grew up in youth group, you might have heard. But that was the exclusive, reference to him being a father. But of course, if you're reading in Hebrew, Abram means exalted father. So there's something about Abraham that is all about fatherhood. And then when God changed his name, he made him Abraham, father of many nations. So then I started to say, okay, I just assumed that Abraham's view of fatherhood was a relic of his primitive culture. So, and it should have no impact on my life or the life of a Western person. But it was so strange to see, modern dads walking around, in our day and age with a understanding of fatherhood that was derived from this man,
Yeah, I think
who lived, however many thousands of years ago.
right. A lot of people today that I talk to, and myself, before I came back to faith in 2013, I looked at Abraham as sort of this archaic, definitely out of touch, irrelevant figure. And as a father, I think the narrative around Abraham for me and other people that had walked away from the Christianity that they were raised with, is that he wasn't the greatest dad, right? It's the whole Genesis 22 story of the, God telling him to sacrifice his son. And that's the story most people with any
Yes.
tertiary knowledge of Scripture would think of when they think of the fatherhood of Abraham. But obviously there's much more to talk about there. And we'll circle back to Abraham in a minute. But what you observed in the Holy Land was such a drastic departure from what you had seen of families in the West. And I'm guessing you came away with this impression that there's something that works about that, right? Because it changed your worldview. But you came back home
Right.
from that trip to this Western civilization that values the individual and is full of families that are mostly, or at least largely, broken. What is the current crisis or situation of the family in the West as you see it?
Well, I think that there's a lot of various threads, but I would say the one that for me personally I wrestle with a lot is the abandonment that of fathers in families. So today in our country, 60% of children will grow up in some part of their childhood and live in a house outside of the house of their biological father.
Is that in
So
the
there
U.S.?
is an epidemic of fathers. Yeah.
60%.
And so, yeah, we'll spend some time of their childhood. And it was much worse in the West Coast, but yeah, it's that's what I'm saying. The majority of families are broken in this regard, where fathers and children get separated regularly, and oftentimes, in my experience, it was a lot of that was directly being created because fathers were not attaching and felt disconnected from their children.
Yeah.
And there's something that we're not. There's a culture-wide problem of fatherlessness that it continues to grow, and in ways that people that study this say that they've just never seen this. In the history of Western civilization, this has never happened before.
Yeah, and do you chalk that? It's so sad to think about 60% plus of kids growing up in this kind of situation you're describing. Is it because families in the West mostly are aiming at the right goal and missing it, or do we just have the wrong goal or definition of family in the West?
Yeah, I would start with there's an identity problem we have in the West. So we don't know how to form identities. Historically, you formed identities first and foremost through your family. And that has been formally and almost universally rejected by our culture. And the consequences are devastating, especially for children. When you think about trying to embrace the identity of father. So you're a young man, you're having a child, and what is it that wakes up this part of your heart that says, I love being a father. I am your father. You are my son. You are my daughter. This is a deep place in your heart. And I would say that, but the problem again with that kind of attachment to another person is that always comes at some level at a cost to your own, what could be an exclusively owned individual identity. So we train men in particular to find their identity through their work. And so in order to allow them to have a real self-contained identity that isn't going to be impacted by others, and so that they can fully live into that in that context. And so that is enormously costly in terms of the way that men relate to families. Whereas in the Middle East, you don't see that kind of identity formation. In the Middle East, they primarily look at their life through their family identity. So men see themselves as sons and as fathers and as a part of a multi-generational family line. And these kinds of identities are very important to them. And they find them aesthetically beautiful and worthy of, when they think about who they are and what they like about themselves, their ability to be a son and a father. This is something they really, or grandfather especially. I mean, that just becomes even more epic. And to us, it's one rejection after another of family identities, because it does conflict with having an identity that's primarily or almost entirely formed around what we feel like is authentically us as an individual, apart from others.
Right. And for men, you said that's mostly tied up in work. What about women?
I mean, I think what we've been training women to do is to say that, and I think women tend to have a more innate desire. This is very generally speaking, an innate desire to embrace their family identity for the sake of their children, because they feel a lot of empathy towards their children. And so even in a culture of hyper individualism, you'll have a far smaller percentage of women rejecting their connection with their children. However, what does the culture say to women? I mean, that's very different, of course, which is that if you really want to form an individual identity, then these kinds of familial attachments are dangerous. I mean, you want to develop an individual identity. Again, and I think we're encouraging them to be like men in the same area, that men have worshiped the idol of their individual identity through work. And so we tell women that the pathway to freedom and self-expression and deeper individual identity and fulfillment is the same pathway. So we're having kind of this really difficult cultural moment, because we've already have an epidemic of fatherlessness that is appalling and is destroying families and creating enormous suffering for children. And now we're subscribing for women to follow the same pathway.
Is it all about work, or is it about money and independence too, or is that all the same issue?
I think it's really about identity. I think that money, all of these things are in service of like, I think we really want to know who we are, and I think people need to know who they are. I think that this is actually a really good feature of being human, is that we care deeply about who we are, and we need to navigate in the world. We have to understand at some kind of core level the who, and so I think that, you know, and what's really interesting too is even the way we raise children today, and I think this is really an expression of because mothers and fathers have really pursued identity outside of the home. You know, we tell children now that the best way for them to find out who they are is to not find any identity in the family, but to go find yourself, find out who you are. Who do you want to be when you grow up? That's such a powerful message. Who do you want to be when you grow up? And then to associate that exclusively with the kind of work profession or vocation you would choose. That is extremely strange.
Yeah.
But that's the message we give. And of course, what happens is, and this is, you know, the way identity is formed is primarily by others, by what others say about you. And so when we tell children that we're not going to give you an identity, we don't want our faith to imprint an identity on you. We don't want our family to give you any root structure about who you are. We don't want that to impinge on you or on us. And so we want you to go find that out there. Well, what we're essentially doing is we're saying that their peers are the ones who are going to form their identity. And so when they go to school, it's not surprising that they suddenly begin to become hypersensitive to labels and groups and subcultures that emerge in these peer-oriented environments, because they're a blank slate from the identity perspective, looking for others to help imprint an identity upon them, because that's the way identity works. It does not flow from some kind of magical core place and then come out of us. It's a deeply negotiated thing that happens in relationship with others. And so this is an extraordinarily dangerous thing to do to children, but this is something that we've just decided that this is actually healthy and good.
Yeah, it's really extraordinarily dangerous to children, but also to I mean, going back to women and to men, all of us really suffer under the weight of this yoke. And I think about women in a sense of how they've been told, just writ large in our culture, that not only is family identity not the best way to find meaning and purpose in life, but it's actually oppressive and demeaning. and objectifying in a way. It's limiting, and all the negative messaging around women who invest in their families in such selfless, devoted ways, as if they are inherently being, oppressed by the male, I guess, patriarchy, right? And they need to break free from that. And in the same way, you could make the same argument about the expectations of men to define ourselves as, successful, rugged individuals and not be shackled by any, nagging wife or ball and chain or kids that, run your life or ruin your life. And it is toxic's not the word. It's sinister, man. There's a spiritual component to this. It feels like that I can't escape.
Yeah. I think that we're all really wrestling with a culture that has decided, like we're seeing the end of this hyper individualism, and I think that it is a really big deal in that I think that there is a world people are beginning to imagine on the other side of this, which is if you see or read what philosophers and sociologists say, if we want to keep doubling down, it really is going to lead to a post-family world, because family does limit. Family does tell you who you are, and family does put on you obligations. And so, but where does this ultimately lead? I mean, David Brooks, he said recently that when Americans become wealthy, they purchase loneliness. And what this really means is that we're all going to die alone, that we're not going to know who we are, that meaning is going to evaporate, that people are going to become hyper narcissistic, that we're not going to know how to work together, and that children are going to suffer terribly. This is not a world that I think we should encourage, but I think we're not being realistic. We don't understand the costs of moving in this direction. So we need to take a step back. And this is where I think ancient cultures can tell us something, because sometimes the best way to recover something you've lost is not to keep pushing forward, but to go and look at the ancient past. Look behind you. Maybe you left something in the past that you shouldn't have left.
Yeah.
And that's what happened to me. It really felt like I was being transported to an ancient culture or to a time, thousands of years ago. Now, there was all the modern conveniences of today, but people had a totally different way of thinking that I began to realize, well, why did we leave this behind? And then as Christians, what really bothered me was I felt like the church really did capitulated from the identity and family perspective to the culture. Like we have not preserved a biblical idea of family in the face of this hyper individualism. We have really allowed family to be redefined and by the culture, and then we accepted that definition. The church accepted the definition.
Help me understand.
With almost no exception.
Give me an example of what you mean with that. And I'm not disagreeing, but I just want to help our listeners really get a sense of what that means. What you mean when you say that the church just accepted the world's definition and then built on it.
So if you were to ask most people what a good family is, Western people, whether they're Christian or not Christian, probably the cleanest, clearest definition is a springboard for individual success. So that's the way we think a good family is. A good family is one that nurtures the children, and the mother and father get something out of it, and then we all launch into our individual lives. And so the degree to which it's a good springboard. So I was sharing this with a leader of a major Christian family ministry once, and I said, okay, let me tell you, there's two definitions, and I gave him that one. I said, first of all, some people think family is a springboard for individual success. And he actually stopped me and said, that's exactly what I think family is, and that's exactly what I'm trying to build in my family. And I was like, wait. Like, there's another definition. And that's what I mean by, and I wasn't surprised, because everywhere I talk about this, probably the easiest analogy to think about that family is the nest.
Right.
It is a nest. That is a perfect analogy. It's like in a nest, you nurture the chickies, and then everyone abandons the nest, and success is simply launching the children into the next generation. Now,
and
one of the ways you'll know,
and then you have an empty nest, right? And then, like,
right.
Mom and Dad get divorced, and Dad finds a younger mom and starts a new nest.
Yes, there are pernicious elements to this narrative. So, and one way you can know if somebody believes this idea of family is simply by asking them, like, can you name your great grandparents? Because they're irrelevant to this idea. Like, where you came from, it does not matter. If we're resetting the family every generation, it doesn't matter where we came from. It doesn't matter that we're not. So that's a very recent idea of family, very strange, historically.
Right.
And so
and you've
this
seen
is
that play out in the
contrast
church.
to another definition. Yes, and that's the reason why in the church we say that the best answer we have is to focus on the family. What we think the problem is that we're not doing our duty. Like we need to force mothers and fathers to love their children. Now, when I was in the Middle East, one of the things I noticed when I got to know some of these Jewish and Arab fathers was not that they were less loving or more loving than a typical Western dad. They weren't. They just saw family differently. They had a different identity. And this is what I mean. Like we have misdiagnosed the problem because we start from the premise of the hyper individualistic Western culture. And then we work backwards into, okay, how do we fulfill these commands given to us in Scripture to stay, to stay married, to not commit adultery, to train our children, to love our kids. How do we do that in the face of the fact that we've already swallowed this idea that my family identity is going to be eroded and my individual identity is paramount? Well,
right.
That's a really unfortunate premise from which to start the conversation because it's not going to lead to a good place.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk about men for a second in this framework. So men are expected in this framework to provide, which I think is a reasonable expectation. It's not inherently evil to expect men to provide for their families, but that becomes something of an idol in itself. Like that becomes the end goal. If I can work hard enough to make enough money, to put enough money back to send my kids to college, then they've left the nest and I've done my job. And if along the way I make my wife happy and all that too, it's great. But that's really the mission. What are men missing out on, and what in the place of that, what should men or could men be focusing on instead?
They should be building a family and not a career, not an individual identity. And that totally changes everything. And the actual actions that you take are very similar in both these models, but you're doing it for different reasons. So if you think like Abraham was always a father. He wasn't going to work in order to express his individual identity. He wasn't going and saying, I'm going to be an amazing camel trader because I want to be known by my friends and by the community as an incredible trader of camels. He was trading camels because he was a father. Not, so that's the difference. And so the way that these men in the Middle East think, the way that everyone in most of history thought about their identity is when you start to have children, when you get married, start to have children, you are now a father and it eclipses your life. It's in work is a nested identity underneath your identity as father. So when I go out to provide, I'm not primarily thinking of how can I experience my individual identity apart from my family. And, sociologists call this the atomization of identity, where we actually pull our identities apart and they don't touch. This is hugely problematic. So how do you overcome that? Well, you have to understand a larger overarching story of your life as I am a part of a family line, and I am being given for a very short period of time the stewardship of this thing called the family. And as a father, my job is to receive the resources, the identity, and the history of that family, and then for a very short period of time, steward it, and then faithfully pass it on to the next generation. And so when I go to work, that's why I'm working. Now it's great for you to do a good job at work. Of course, I think it's important that in that identity, you find projects to do that really bless the world. And I think you can do this, but don't atomize. If you're single, you can atomize it. I think it's possible. And that's a different conversation. But if you're a father, to say that as I go to work, I am leaving behind my fatherhood identity and I'm going into a new identity, that is a vestige of the Industrial Revolution. Like if you look at it like Little House on the Prairie, some of you guys might have remembered this show, but it was basically the way most of the world was before the Industrial Revolution. So when Pa, in that he's Pa all the time. Like he's Pa when he's like, working in the town. He's Pa when he's working in the field. He's Pa when he comes home. He's wearing the same hat all the time, right? That's the way that we used to live. And whether you worked in the trades or you worked on the farm, or you worked in other at the government, you were a father. And when I'm talking to a lot of these Middle Eastern men, it's so interesting that they talk like that. They think like that. They see themselves as a father everywhere they go. Whereas in our culture, like I leave that hat, I take off the fatherhood hat when I go to work, and I put on a different hat. And so if I'm looking at my family saying, look, I am providing, like I am giving you the money that, but you have switched teams. You're no longer on our team. And what's really sad is when the coach switches teams. Like that is so unfortunate. And that's what's happening. The coach is saying, I'm going to go join somebody else's team at work, and I'm going to use the resources to like fund what these guys are, but I'm going to pull all the family then cannot form an identity around your son or your daughter can only feel their sonship or their daughterhood to the extent that the father experiences his fatherhood. And so if he's going to switch teams, then what does that leave his wife and his children?
Right. I'm struggling a little bit with that concept just because I never felt I have and had as I was growing up a good father. I don't ever remember feeling betrayed by him, going to the paper mill and not bringing me with him, even just in his, spirit or presence or identity wise. But can you help me understand, maybe first of all, like where that comes from in the West? Is it a product of capitalism and consumerism? And why is it a bad thing that a father, in this case, compartmentalizes work from family? Yeah.
So, I mean, you're definitely going to see this play out very differently depending on the temperament of the man. And so if you have a nurturing father or dutiful father, you're going to experience this a lot. You're going to experience the effects of this not as dramatically. If you have a really ambitious father, you're going to have a problem. And to the extent that he uses those sort of like hard driving traits to push into the workplace, you're going to feel this distance. I think you'll feel it in any of these regards. But I think that there's a huge percentage of men who are going to leave their family in the dust in the pursuit of their individual lives, either for selfish reasons, or like I said, like for identity. And so this is a construct. So that's why it's important to, you look at the statistics. There's still a large percentage of men who are being there for their family. We're really asking a much larger and society-wide question here, and saying, why is there such an enormous percentage of men who are distancing themselves from their family, and what's going on there? And so I would say that all men could really benefit from really trying to understand what is work a subset of my family identity, or is that something that's uniquely a part of my individual identity? And I think that if we began to culturally, especially at least in the church, adopt kind of the way Abraham thought and begin to think about work as a subset of a family identity, I think that for men, particularly men that are really trying to aggressively build things in the world, they're not going to feel this disconnection. And how that works out in a particular man's life and his family's life is going to look very diverse. It doesn't mean that he has to bring his kids to work all the time. I think it starts in the heart. Yeah. It starts like, what is he doing?
Sure.
And if he's distancing himself in his heart from his family because of his work, because I've got this calling or I'm pursuing this thing, then that's dangerous.
Yeah.
Like in my wife's family, her father, I don't think he thought about this, theologically or philosophically, but he wasn't super excited about his career. He was more excited about his family. Just individually, he was more excited about his family. And I think that because of that, he did a great job as a dad. And that's what I mean by there are some dads who I think this isn't going to play out 100% of the time. It's going to play out an enormous amount of time, though, particularly with certain kinds of men.
Right. No, I'm following you now. And I think focusing on this issue as an issue of the heart of the father, is really helpful to me to get to the heart of what you're talking about, which is that it sets a tone. It sets a tone in a man's life. It sets a tone for his identity, and it naturally just exudes from his heart to the world around him, to his family when he's home, to his workplace, to his peers, that he is first and foremost finding his identity in God, but also in his family. One other thing that came to mind real quick is just how church involvement can be another compartment in that kind of framework, where you go to church as a family, but it's just kind of a show, or kind of a thing you have to do, an obligatory thing that you do as a family to show the world around you that, this is a good family man, and isn't dad a great dad, and but the kids know who he really is at home, and it just doesn't. There's a disconnect, and that seems to be leading to a mass exodus of kids when they grow up in the church. Some churches, sometimes, they leave en masse in young adulthood.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I think that's kind of what I'm describing. It's the more that we all see ourselves from the perspective of our individual identity, we're going to tend to live these very hypocritical lives where we compartmentalize. You're going to have a very different experience of me if you meet work Jeremy, versus church Jeremy, versus dad Jeremy, versus husband Jeremy. And what happened in the past was these identities. That's why they have to be properly nested, inside of each other, as opposed to atomized as very separate expressions of who we are. And so that's and so to try to figure out where does our family identity fit in that like hierarchy of who we are. What used to happen is that the culture would just very much get around this idea that you are a father, and so you cannot be a great man if you destroy your family. And so that was understood. But today, a man can pursue his career, leave his family in tatters, and be considered culture-wide a great man. Mm-hmm. And we don't understand the messages that what that sends is so dangerous downstream to young fathers who are trying to figure out, okay, what does it look like to pursue a good life? Well, it looks like if I can just pour myself into work and really build up that identity, then I will, regardless of what happens to my family, because family is tough. Family is, messy. Kids are, challenging. Marriage is always very, very challenging. And so, as a man, you're going to find yourself, and as women as well, you're going to find a work situation that's you're going to find success far more predictable than family life. Family life is much messier. And so if you give people the option, it totally makes sense why they're picking, option B, not the family.
Can I ask you just one more question along? We're a little bit in some negative territory here. We've kind of been a downer so far probably, but one more question before we pivot and get to some solutions that you found in your ministry. And I'm going to take off a practical advice hat and put on like a conspiratorial hat, because what I hear a lot lately from people is that there is, and this is largely from Christians who observe culture and say, well, this anti-family move is a conspiracy of sorts. It's like a movement that's intentional in some subsets of the culture. I hear words like neo-Marxist a lot lately. I hear like public schools / social agenda to indoctrinate our kids to separate them from family. Like, do you see any of that playing into this problem, or is that just sort of an after effect of something that changed a long time ago in our culture because we took our eye off the ball?
Yeah, I definitely think that there are lots of different causes, and I would say that the ones like a neo-Marxist agenda, that's an extremely if you think about this philosophically, there are philosophical through lines in that definitely makes sense to destroy the family. I don't think, if you ask me how influential are those on why the family is broken down in our culture, I'd say not very. But the problem is, you put somebody in the situation I was in when I was 23 and single and thought family was kind of messy and an experiment that clearly doesn't work well and certainly not very beautiful or aesthetically pleasing. And then you start to present a philosophical way to get to the good life to get to utopia that is post-family, I'm going to be very susceptible to trying to understand that if I'm, philosophically minded and really want to understand things from that perspective. And so I think that it's really, I think it started with the breakdown of the family really was created because of ideas, certainly, that we accepted in the West, this hyper-individualism. But I don't think that the hyper-individualism itself was a anti-family, in like consciously anti-family. I think that now that we're looking for a path forward, there is a lot more. There's a book that just got published this month called "Abolish the Family." You can read it. And so these kind of very overt calls that we will never get to a society that's equal if there's a family. Like, that's true. Like, families are deeply, they create in the foundation of every society deep inequality, far more inequality than anything else. If you were raised by great parents who loved you and, provided for you and resourced you, there is absolutely no way that some, child raised in, if you look statistically at, somebody who's a similar group of children raised by parents who abandoned them and didn't provide for them, didn't encourage them. I mean, this is the source of the deepest inequity in society. And so if you do have a philosophical sort of picture of society that the good society is one in which we provide perfect equality, then the family is always going to be an obstacle to that.
Yeah. There seems to be a common thread among movements, social movements, and organizations that have impact in our society for now a couple of generations, as far as I can tell, that do seem to be inclined toward like the social good. Like, they seem to have good intentions, but they seem to always want to go after the nuclear family, to the detriment of the vision they claim they have for, a more human flourishing.
Right. Yeah, that's because what's really there's this different, like, probably subconscious realities. I mean, if you were deeply disappointed by your father or your mother, then how are you going to create and you really care about society, and you're like it didn't work for me. Mm-hmm. Like it's a source of maybe my deepest pain in my life. Why would I ever go and try to promote that human flourishing is by propping up this broken system called the family? Right. It definitely makes sense why that, and that's why we need divine revelation. This is why I think the church is really, we really have to take a step back and think about this, because and this is maybe as we pivot, so much is at stake here. The gospel itself, like when we talk about family, the family is not nearly as important as the gospel. The gospel and presenting the gospel faithfully to the world is far more important, but the gospel means good news. And the reality is that the gospel, the good news, is always communicated through familial language. Jesus came to reveal God as our Father. Jesus presented himself. His favorite title for himself was as the Son, mm-hmm. and that God wants to create a family, and the church is supposed to be this family of brothers and sisters. And so, what happens in a society when you destroy fatherhood and motherhood and sonship and sisterhood and brotherhood? How can the gospel ever be received as good news in a society that all of those things are bad, all those experiences are painful, and that we have created another way of being that really eclipses those archaic ideas? And I believe that the family actually exists primarily to present the gospel. I think the gospel is actually larger and bigger and more important than family. I think that God wanted to tell a story to humanity, and he created family as a vehicle through which that story would resonate with humanity. And this is why I think the enemy is so adamant that it has to be destroyed, because otherwise the gospel cannot be received by people as good news. Right.
Fascinating. So in a nutshell, what does God want for the family? How is God's vision for family distinct from this cultural vision that you've discussed so far?
Yeah, so theologians like to talk about how important it is to look at when a concept is first mentioned in Scripture, because oftentimes in the origin story of the concept, you get its definition. And I definitely think this is true about the family. So the first family we have, the first time it's described in the Bible, is in Genesis 1. And in Genesis 1, God creates the world, and then he creates the first family, male and female, and then he brings them together. And so Genesis 1 is really a poem that sort of theologically unpacks the meaning of creation. And then he says over the first family these words: be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over all of creation. And I think in that description, you have the purpose of family, because God created a family for a reason, and he really lays out the reason. And so God has a job that he wants done, right? He's done that work of creation like an incredible artist. He's made all of creation beautiful, and he just says over it, "This is so good. This is beautiful. This is good." And so he wants the goodness of creation to be spread across all of the world. And he starts with this prototypical garden, Eden, and then he wants to see his presence, his order, his beauty expanded across the earth. And so what he does is he creates a family. This is very strange, because if we had a job like this to do, I think we would create a nonprofit, we'd create a business, we'd create a government. The last thing we would
maybe an army,
if we had a job this enormous, would be to create a family.
Right.
Is that?
Maybe an army. It's something that could get the job done.
Yeah. Yes. And I do think he created an army, but not the way we think of an army, right? Which is he created a family, because if you actually look at the components of what he's telling the family to do, you can then quickly see emerging the definition of family. So if a family, he's given the family a job, so the family has a mission. So it starts, God has something he wants it to do. He gives it a mission, but he wants them to do it together. He doesn't give it to an individual. He gives it to the family. But then he gives them a mission so enormous that it can't be accomplished in one generation. And so that somehow this mission has to be passed on from one generation to the next. And it can only be accomplished through a whole bunch of generations, with lots of children, lots of multiplying, lots of family. And so what is this definition of family then? It's a multi-generational team on mission. I think that's the most simple way to say it. And this is totally different idea of family than the Western idea of family. So we talked earlier that a family is a springboard for individual success and is a nest. But if in Genesis 1, the family is a multi-generational team on mission, and so instead of a nest, we're a team, imagine the difference.
Yeah.
And one of the things I love about this picture of the family as a team is that culturally, we know the difference between, one of the things that I think Western culture really has preserved very well is when you join a team, like all of a sudden, all of the rules change. Like then sacrifice becomes noble, right? So if you go to a counselor and you say, "Oh, I'm sacrificing, for my coworkers, I'm sacrificing for my family," they'll say, whoa, like that's unhealthy. You need to think about yourself. What do you need? But if you're on a team, if I'm playing a football team, and I'm struggling, and I tell the coach, I'm sacrificing. Yeah, that's what we're doing here. We're all sacrificing. We're all equally working together for this goal. Like all of a sudden in a team, the sort of almost the ideas about how sacrifice is perceived is turned upside down, and it becomes beautiful to everyone. And we just love watching it. And we can't stand it when we see somebody being hyper selfish. So yeah, these are such different pictures.
Yeah. Are you saying that the element of sacrificing for one's family is lost in the world's view of family, and that's almost seemed like made out to be a grievance or a form of oppression? And if we were to reclaim this mission,
yes,
you're talking about, or this vision of family, that maybe sacrifice could be reclaimed with it?
Yes. So the idea of roles, the idea of sacrifice, these are ideas that everyone celebrates once you join a team. These are ideas that if you start to talk about outside of the context of team are deeply unhealthy, right? So if you go to a counselor and say, "I'm just trying to live into my role, it doesn't really feel like it fits really well. And, and I'm doing all this sacrificing and I feel like I'm losing myself," like immediately you're going to get the advice that, hey, that's unhealthy. That's toxic. You need to, and so you can see the difference. But it depends on the context, because we don't think family is a team. Then I think all that advice is actually good advice. Like if the family is a springboard for individual success, and my family is getting in the way of my individual success, then why would it's unhealthy and toxic for the family to continue to try to get me to play a role, to sacrifice for the group. Like all of that becomes unhealthy. But if the family is a team, then again, it reverses all those things. If I'm playing my role, if I'm sacrificing, these things then become beautiful,
Yeah.
and everyone celebrates them on a team. And that's why I think we have to take this crazy step back and say, what is the family? And actually admit, maybe we don't even know what a family is.
So let's pick apart this 4-word definition of family that you offered here. Multi-generational team on mission. When you say multi-generational, obviously that means 2 or more generations, but I don't see any explicit sort of definition of that being just bloodlines. Obviously, you would allow for adopted children to be included in families, but what about other people being invited into a family, even if they're not, bloodlines or adopted situations, like lonely friends or folks that just don't have a family of their own? How does that work in your framework?
Yeah. So in the scripture, I really think that the story kind of continued to grow as we got more revelation about what God was up to. And when you get into the new covenant, we are given, in addition to the understanding of family we get from the Old Testament, we're now invited into a story in which God says, Jesus says, God is the father of all the believers, and that he wants all of us to be a family, and that we get to, through the church, get to experience being brothers and sisters. And so this story, which is a real story, we're adopted into God's family. Paul makes the case in Galatians 3 that we are all actually adopted into the family of Abraham. And so being in that family now, adoption and the church and expanding and bringing in, and then you have even Paul calling Timothy my son. You have disciples. That really is about, again, using familial relationships. It's about fathering. God, Paul, when he's in the church, says, you have all these guardians, and says in 1 Corinthians 4, but I am your father. We do have to be really careful that when we're building bloodline families in a place where we're believing the gospel, that we are first and foremost doing that as a way to express and participate in this larger family of God we call the church.
That's awesome. And the second word, team, is intentional for you as well. I know by looking into your work, you could have said unit, you could have said,
Yes.
Patriarchy, you could have said hierarchy, whatever. You said team for a reason. What is that reason?
Yeah, because, if you think about, and kind of going all the way back to the garden, you see immediately the children like Cain and Abel, and this is, of course, all of us have experienced this, is that our children are wired very differently. Husbands and wives are wired differently. And that is such an important, how do you all work together if you all have these different, it's actually it's not a bug, it's a feature. We all have different gifts. And so every single time God blesses our family with a new child, it's like if you were doing the NFL draft, God's like, you need all the things child has that I'm going to place in his or her soul and in his or her ability. Your family team needs that. And so a lot of times when we're talking to families about trying to even uncover their unique mission or their calling or assignments, oftentimes you discover that through learning the different teammates that God has placed on your team. And this is an incredible picture, because imagine if every family thought this way. If every family looked at their children, looked at, and saw, this also makes sense of why it's so beautiful to have more children. Really in the individualistic culture, children, the more children you have, it's sort of like carving up a very fixed pie, and so there's a very understandable reasons why, as the more individual we get, the less children we have. But if the family is a team, then yeah, you certainly have a team with a very few number of players, and that works great, and there's great expressions of that. But I think you would always celebrate, God, wow, look, he just brought a new member into our team. Isn't that amazing? What does that mean? What does that mean we're going to get to do as a family?
Yeah, and I also love and appreciate how you extrapolate that point out even further in some of your work about men, because something about being on a team lights most men's fire, right? It's we're designed for it, we're made for it, we come alive when we're a part of a team, when we have a role on a team. gosh, I don't think I've ever felt more alive than when I got to coach my son's little league teams. Like, if I could do that as a full-time job, I would, because I'd make a draft board. They're like 6 years old. I'm like totally just objectifying their skill sets and sizing up their parents to see how much trouble or help they might be, and trying to make a whole like season-long strategy for winning.
Yes.
And then I go home and I'm not half as intentional about winning at home with my own team at home, right? But that just tells me we have this instinct that's just waiting to be sparked. And that's what I think is so good about your work. So I really appreciate that. Now, the last line in that mission, last word in that mission is in that definition is mission. So we have a multi-generational team on mission, and actually on mission is an important word too, because you don't say as mission.
That's right.
You say on mission. So just kind of flesh that out for us real quick.
Yeah. Thanks for saying, because I think that there is a confusion. I would say that most people, most believers who were really on fire for mission, and they had a family, did in the last 100 years, family and mission, right? Where family is this thing I do over here, mission's over here. So, that was probably most dramatically lived out by like Billy Graham, who talked about it a lot towards the end of his life, how he would leave his family for 6 months at a time to be on mission, and how this is actually celebrated and was celebrated by the missionary movement for the last 150 years in the Protestant church.
Right.
And it's very unfortunate, but that's the family and mission paradigm. There was a time where Billy Graham said he was driving home and he saw this girl playing in the meadow and said, "Who's that?" And somebody said, "Oh, that's your daughter."
Wow.
And the height of irony to me was that his son ended up taking over his ministry. And of course, if you looked, because I think that the reason why we did family and mission is because we mistakenly thought it was more strategic. We don't need Billy Graham's family. We only need Billy. Like, the family is a distraction. Put him on a mountain in North Carolina. We need Billy Graham. And ironically, the legacy of that ministry is now in the hands of his son. So it doesn't always happen that way, but man,
Right.
like we need to wake up to that. So then there's family as mission, which I think is increasingly being something people are considering, which is sort of like, maybe the mission is just to raise a good and beautiful family. And maybe if we just, find some property somewhere and I'll be a dad and, I'll be with my family, then that is a beautiful picture. But of course, that's not what we exist for others. Our families are blessed to be a blessing. When God described and called Abraham, he didn't call Abraham to just build a family and be a family apart. He built him and he called him to be a family to bless other families. So being a multi-generational family on mission is about like, okay, we have to accept and embrace that our family, I'm raising a team multi-generationally to do something in the kingdom of God. And that if I don't take my team onto the field and actually play the game, then what's the point of being a team at all?
Yeah, I really appreciated that, because I have always had this instinct that marriage is about mission, and every marriage should have a mission statement. And during premarital counseling, seasons of life, I'll lead them through that process, and usually I'll read the mission statement they have at their wedding as part of the sermon at their wedding, and it's a really beautiful moment. But as far as the family at large, I don't think I've ever quite as much thought about a mission statement for a family. Would you say that every family, every Christian family, let's say, should have the same mission, or does the family discern its own mission and declare it and then rally around it individually as a family?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Well, certainly it's important to start by saying that the family does come preloaded with a mission.
Okay.
So in Genesis 1, it says, "Be fruitful and multiply, subdue and rule." And so we how do you express that? And I think that mission was recast in Matthew 28 by Jesus when he says, "Go and make disciples of all nations, and teach them to obey everything I've commanded you." It's the same mission, right? Because making disciples is essentially being fruitful and multiplying. And subduing and ruling is about bringing all of the world under the commands, the ruler, the king of Jesus as king, and so you can make children through making disciples, and you can make children by having children and making them disciples. But we have that mission. We all are on the same mission to make disciples. And that's really the fruitful, multiply, subdue, and rule. Now, the ruling part of that, where a family actually begins to become a ruling family, where there are resources or assets or ministries or callings that we're stewarding as a family, and that we're bringing God's order into the world. We're expressing the kingdom of God through our family into the world. I think that is something that can look very unique depending on your family. So what are those callings? And sometimes we like to think, okay, there are assignments. So some families have assignments that are temporary or, that are seasonal. Then there are larger missions that sometimes families are given that may be like to go after a particular ill in society, to build up the church in an area, to go after their neighborhood and really be a light, like to articulate what it means to take your family onto the field and actually what it means to score. Because I think that one of the things that men find, one of the reasons why men and women, but men especially, find sports so intoxicating is because it's so clear what the mission is, and that is so exciting. Like it's who's won the Super Bowl. Like I know, when they catch the pass and they score a touchdown, I know that that's worth 6 points.
Right.
And so I think we owe it to our families to try to increase the resolution on the mission.
Wow. To bring clarity. Clarity brings momentum. I agree,
Yes.
100%.
Yes.
What does a family or a father even do when they know it's time to change course, but they've never been a part of a family like the one you're describing? Their family growing up wasn't like that. They've never even seen it up close, but somebody's listening right now and they're like, all right, I want to give this a go. Like, what are the first few steps that you take to change course in such a dramatic way if you've never introduced these principles to your family life before?
Yeah, I have a huge heart for this, because I think that, when you are building a family as a nest and a springboard for individual success, all the tools for family building in our culture are designed around that idea, right? So schools are designed to atomize the family into its individual components and school them. Sports are designed to, not to be family sports, right? We're going to take the family and spread it as an individual. Shopping and hobbies and, lots of church ministries tend to, break down the family into its individual components before, it does anything. And so the problem is, if you adopt this definition of family, you're going to open your toolbox for, okay, cool, I want to build a family as a team. the toolbox is going to be empty. And so, we've been talking about like, how do we fill the toolbox? What are the basic tools that somebody can get a hold of to actually create this kind of a family? And so there are many, many tools that we talk about at family teams, but I always like to talk about the, three basic tools that are probably the ones that initially you can do. We can get deeper into these, but I'll tell you real quick. One is to craft a family mission statement. So you do know what you're doing, you do know how to score, and that oftentimes will include also creating kind of family values, or we like to call them pillars, because we want to create a certain kind of family culture, and this creates that identity, that bed of identity, that where your children and you and your spouse will feel like you're a part of this family. The second one is a family rhythm. So one of the things that happens is that every other sort of element of what crafts our day, our work, if we're on a team, our hobbies tend to go first, and the family gets just the scraps that are left over. So, and so if you're going to live that way, it's very difficult to run a team. If you're a coach, there's probably not a lot of coaches that come to their team and just say, hey, everyone decide for themselves, like what time you have left over, and then we'll be a team on whatever that, because everyone's going to have different time left over. So there's no way you can coach a team. You don't actually like craft a rhythm, like for when we do things together. And so but families today are not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to go to the school or the coach or the pastor or whatever and just say, hey, here's our family rhythm. And so this is really difficult. So we talk about that proactively. And the third one is, and this is something we learned in Israel, was that if you craft a family meal, like a weekly family meal, that is deeply reflective of your family culture, and you experience that evening, not the weekday family meal oftentimes we talk about in the West, which is like, let's catch up real quick before we all, separate again. But no, let's just be a family for one evening a week. then you will not be able to stop a multi-generational family from forming. And we can, we saw this in Israel. Like, it's crazy on Shabbat. All these kids in their 20s and 30s are all getting on buses, are all taking their young kids to their parents' house every single Friday night. And man, you do that, you craft that kind of a rhythm in your family where there's that much interaction that happens on a weekly basis, and it's the pinnacle of your week when you really get to enjoy the depth of relationships. That multi-generational family will happen through a tool that powerful, even if you don't a clear vision for it.
Yeah. Wow. So we talk about the rhythm of life and how you said it's like families are not allowed to chart their own course in a way and to have their time together. What's the way out of that? I know you've talked a lot about the importance of Sabbath, and that seems to be the biblical model of God's plan for us, is to have a Sabbath day every week together. How have you seen that work in the context of real life?
Yeah, man, it's tough. I mean, that taking that kind of ground, you have to really be persistent, and you have to start small and be very steady in terms of how to do that. Oftentimes that's how we've seen families really try to put a stake in the ground. And I do think that if you do choose as a family to keep a Sabbath day, and that is to say that one day a week, we're going to just experience things, together. We're going to go deep into rest. We're not going to, say yes to everything else. And of course, there's always going to be some exceptions, but I think that that's part of the process of learning how to lead a family. Is how do you control of time? You have to lead time, and you have to design time in such a way that it is designed around what you value as a family. And so for us, we encourage families to really consider this idea of picking one day a week and practicing Sabbath, both for all of the, for the reasons of needing rest, for the reasons of experiencing the gospel, and for this sort of resisting the cultural, because once you say, look, this day is off limits, we're going to rest on this day, we're going to be together, we're going to craft our family culture around this 24-hour period, you will people will be shocked. They will will assault the walls of that 24-hour period. And so you have to decide how important, really a practical way to try to decide, is this something I really want to do or not?
Yeah, because saying yes to that is saying no to everything else that might come up during that 24-hour period that might disrupt the rest. And you have to do that as father, your wife has to do it as mother, and your kids have to do it as well. What is it that you and your family do, like just practically? Give me a day, like starting when to when, and what happens in those 24 hours, just as briefly as you can.
Sure. Well, we do on Friday night a meal. And so when our kids were really little, it was really simple because we were exhausted and just trying to sustain this rhythm. As we've gotten older and our kids are older and we've enfolded our parents, now we have, probably 12 to 15 people that come over on Friday night, mostly family, but sometimes extended in the kingdom. They'll come over and we'll experience just a timeless moment where, we light a candle, we say we're resting, we sing a song, we bless the sons, we bless the daughters. My dad, usually the oldest member of the family, the oldest patriarch or matriarch, will do the blessings. And so that's usually, either my parents or April's mom. And then we just have this great meal. Then we rest together. We'll play games. We'll study the Bible. Different seasons, we'll do different things. We have pickleball court in the backyard, so we go play pickleball. Like we just enjoy it. We build a fire. And so that's Friday night. And then what we do on Saturday is we try to think about, and this takes time to figure out, like, really, how do you recharge? And I call this finding your off button. And for most people, they think that rest, their intuition is to rest, you just stop working.
Right.
And that's unfortunately not the way rest works. You have to discover what kind of activities actually restore you and recharge you. And so this has always been a negotiation that we've had to work out with all of us. Like, what are the, and so for me, I go to a coffee shop, I drink a cortado, I do a lot of journaling and praying and reading for like 2 or 3 hours. Now, when my kids were little, it was very different. April would go to a coffee shop. I would stay home. I would try to keep the kids alive. You know, they would get up. You know, this would be the one day a week they might be able to, you know, watch something without, you know, us getting up or something.
Yeah.
And so there's kind of like a morning rhythm. You want to create a morning rhythm. Then you want to create sort of like an early afternoon rhythm of rest, you know. And so with little kids, for us, that oftentimes look like going on an outing, you know, and then during different seasons, like then we come home, take a nap, and then we have sort of an early evening and then a later evening rhythm. And so we just look at these blocks, and we're not trying to schedule anything. We're not trying to be productive. We're just trying to figure out what's a pattern that just recharges us. And
Right.
now I would tell you, after we've practiced this for something like 15, 17 years, I am so recharged on my just typical Sabbath that I have an explosion of creative energy on Sunday. But that took a long time for me to not only discover how to do that, how to make sure that was happening for my whole family, but also, you know, to do it consistently enough so that during the week I know that's coming, and so I can go flat out during a week of work.
Yeah.
So my productivity has gone way up, but it took me some time. I had to learn how to totally recharge in order for that to actually benefit, you know, my work.
Yeah, I love the practical wisdom of starting the night before, and I've always said like the great day begins the night before. That's what I tell my kids all the time. But living that out practically by starting with the meal the night before really gets you started right for the next morning, and you wake up ready for the rest that you've got in store for you. It must be intentional. It's never easy, I guess. At least not when you start out. It sounds like you've got your heads around it now, but in the world's model of family, what happens, I think, is the kids are the clients, and the parents are like customer service representatives or something, and you're like working for them, so that you know the customer is always right. So it's telling them no when they want to do something or be involved in something, or when they want to play in another league or whatever. It's almost unthinkable. What do you say to your kids when something comes up that might be a violation of your family identity and practice, especially in terms of Sabbath or whatever you're doing?
Well, this is why the rhythm is so important, you know, to talk through, because, you know, one way to avoid having to say no to your kids about everything else that's happening is for you to actually proactively do things with that time. So, for example, when our kids were little, you know, we knew we wanted our kids to be involved in sports. So we just started doing family sports. So we did tennis for a whole season. We did 3 years of Taekwondo. You know, now we're doing we figured out there's a handful of sports, these magical sports that actually everyone at various age groups can participate and actually have fun and be exercised. There's ways to do it. And so we do that with our time. That's one thing that we had to do that really helped us. Another thing is, because we live into a really tight 7-day rhythm, and we repeat and we constantly are sort of refining that. And we have an annual summit where we sit down with our kids and we talk about like what is a Monday, what is a Tuesday, what is a Wednesday, is it working for us? And so we have, like, our kids love our normal week. I love our normal. It works for us because that took many iterations. And so it's very difficult for our kids to want to, at this point, say no to things that we're doing. They had a very strong voice in the conversation as we were designing the rhythm. They can enfold their friends into our rhythmic activities. They know there are certain nights that are definitely open. They can go and hang out with their friends. We're not doing anything as a family on those at those times. So that's how we kind of approached it, is to, you know, so like Wednesday night, we have a really good meal. We watch a movie together, you know, that's kind of our, you know, our time for that. Saturday night is, you know, game time with Papa. Like, my dad, he was an only child, so he used to, you know, play all of these board games by himself. And so he's all this like funny kind of nostalgia about board games. And so all of his grandkids come over and he just plays board games with them on Saturday night while April and I go on our date night. You know, our kids love that. My dad, he has an amazing spread of like all the coolest snacks and drinks, and, you know, but again, that was something we talked about as a family. Like, okay, do we want to do this? And certainly if there's something going on that they want to participate in, you know, that's something we want to, you know, consider, and we certainly say yes to a lot of those things. But man, if some activity wants to come and like grab huge parts of our rhythm, our kids are more aware than anyone of the cost of that. if they're like, I'm going to join a sport where there's 4 or 5 practices in a game every week, like that's going to devastate our family life. I mean, they have all 5 of them have universally said absolutely not, like voluntarily they
Wow.
would not want to watch that, you know. And what's interesting too, now that our kids are getting older and becoming adults, and they're such close friends with each other because of all the time they spent together, and they're watching, you know, kind of what, you know, we all knew happened, and that is that when you prioritize all your peers and then they all scatter, and then, you know, I don't hardly know anybody that I was friends with in high school, you know, but man, I mean, I still know my siblings, you know, and like, so they are experiencing that, the fruit of having spent all of that time investing in the family relationships and enfolding others, their friends and others, into that vortex, as opposed to us all going out and blowing up the family every week to like all pursue individual things, and then to really invest in relationships that probably aren't going to last.
Do you find a sort of city on the hill effect where other people's, like your friends, your kids' friends want their families to be more like yours? Like, do you ever, I mean, I know that's a weird question, but do you ever sense that from them? Like there's a longing?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, I didn't, when we first experienced that, and I didn't know that was happening. But when we did, like, I started doing the Sabbath dinner we were describing, and we were a part of a house church plant where we all kind of went off and did like a retreat together. And as an exercise in the retreat, we just asked everyone to share your top 3 milestones of your faith, your whole spiritual journey. What are the top 3? And we went around the whole room, and every single person in the room said one of the top 3 milestones of their entire spiritual journey was the first time they had Shabbat at our table. I was in total shock because we barely were surviving at that stage. Like, we had little kids, and we were trying, like, how do we, but you know, we really did experience, you know, a beautiful dinner as a family. And I think that, yeah, people see that, and there's a part of their heart that just completely wakes up, and it does have an effect on your spiritual life.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, this still raises the question for me about how to help families pivot when they've been living under one set of definitions about family identity, et cetera.
Yeah.
And, you know, all of a sudden they have to start telling their kids no to things, and they don't come with that culture built in from birth. Like, sounds like you've raised your family, you and your wife have raised your family with those expectations. Do you have any, like, I know it's a hard one, do you have any just brief word of advice for parents that want to change the game midstream?
Yeah, I've definitely talked to a number of families that have done this, and typically the progression that they have described that has worked the best for them is the father first stands in front of his family and repents.
Wow.
This is tough.
All right.
But he's like, guys, I actually tried to build our family as a nest. I have been encouraging this hyper individualism in our family. I've led us in this way, and I'm sorry. I didn't, you know, look, I was ignorant and maybe selfish, but I didn't realize that what I was doing to our family, and I'm so sorry. Okay. And so, you know, would you forgive me, you know, and would you give me a chance to lead this family in a different direction? Like, you know, kids, they'll like, whoa, what's like that will move their heart, you know, if they love their dad. And I would say that then that the father, like any good coach, you get very close. You need to get connected to your children's hearts first. And that's got to come first. I'm not going to sacrifice my connection to my child's heart on the altar of some great plan or vision of mine. But if I have their heart, I do think that I can win them over to a vision. So start there, repent, get, you know, and then negotiate with your kids. If they're teenagers, like, I would certainly not bring in a regime like some kind of tyrant. That's not gonna help your kids.
Yeah.
So say, hey, like, okay, I know that, you know, you've got all these sports or these things you got going, or you got all your friends you love, but hey, is there certain things we can do? Like, let's look at our week. Like, what is there a night that we can like call our family night? And let's practice that as a family first, and then we'll start to involve more of your friends. And, you know, but can we protect this night? You know, like, so you do it a step at a time, a week at a time. And this is why I find the week such a great tool. And God tells us in, you know, Genesis and Exodus that basically the 7 days is there for us to learn how to order our lives. And so you basically take back small bits of time at a time in your weekly rhythm, in a deep, heartfelt connection conversation with your kids, and see where that takes you.
That's awesome. And I know we're over time. I just have one more just practical question, and then I want you to tell us and our listeners how to find your stuff online and to dig deeper with you and your work. I got to ask you about technology and your thoughts and advice about kids with technology and expectations parents should have, boundaries parents should set around, these devices that we've all gotten so accustomed to carrying around. What's your policy at home, and what's best practice as you see it?
Yeah, man, it is hard. It's I mean, so much of this question comes down to how immersed is your child in a culture of technology with their peers. Because if you're doing a lot of homeschooling and you got a lot of like control of the culture of your child, then you can stave off a lot of these things much more easily. And so the policies, we did about 20% public school, 80% homeschool with our kids. So usually around high school and in elementary school, our kids would do a year at public school, and we would kind of work out, this how to think about this. And so what we did is, through middle school, we basically, our kids didn't have phones. They didn't go to public school. I think middle school and social media, it is so hard on kids, especially girls. I have 4 daughters. I mean, it is incredibly difficult. But once our kids started to really more integrate with their peers, and they started to experience school and more of the technology, and they got a phone, what we did was we really approved one app at a time. And I think sometimes when we give kids the phone, we're just like, here's everything in the universe and every kind of technology company coming at you all at once. And there are billions of dollars of research to figure out how to addict you. Good luck, son, daughter. It's like,
right.
Like that is not that, we have to be realistic about how difficult this is. I can't resist half the things they're throwing at me. How can I expect my 16-year-old? And so around 16, our kids would get a phone. And so we would, the internet's off, like, they can, there's certain things they can do. We talk about, time, texting, group, like we kind of work that stuff out. And then we would approve one app at a time. And so they would come and make a case like, hey, Dad, I really want this, download this app. Like, we're like, all right, let's do like a trial period, see how that works. And social media is always the most resistant, thing we are to. And we introduced our kids to social media via launching their own business. And so most of our kids would get their first Instagram account, 16, 17 years old, as a business account. They wouldn't put their face on it. I want my kids to learn how social media works, but I want them to like be a creator and a producer of content and not a consumer. And so our kids were, going down the creator route very deeply, and not, sort of socializing with their friends in intensive ways on their phone.
Yeah, that's really good. I like the measured approach and understanding that every kid or every situation is going to be different with this. Like it's not a one size fits all issue. Well, Jeremy, I'm so grateful for the time you spent with us. You spent more time with us than we asked for. I'm really, really appreciative of that. How would anybody listening or watching right now find more of your work and get more engaged with what you and April are doing?
Yeah. So familyteams.com is a great place to go. And if you guys, we've got my book, Family Revision, Jefferson, Bethke. So Jeff and Alyssa Bethke are our co-founders and owners of that ministry. And so you can go and get Jeff's book, Take Back Your Family. It's so helpful. Jeff's book really kind of goes through the really historical things that happened that made this this movement so pervasive in our culture. And then in terms of like what kind of tools you guys want, I mean, we've a lot of times it starts with going to a family teams weekend. We do these weekends all over the place. We're gonna get to do one there in Houston soon at Story Church. And so I think it's a great place to come just to like, it's really hard to have this conversation. It's just so foundational that it's hard to just do this in the margin. So I just want people to take a weekend and really think about this. How do you build those first few tools? Get in a community of people, particularly if you're in a church that is starting to, think about this. There's more people, like that's really helpful because this is hard. This is a hard transition. And then we're on all the social channels. We're constantly, trying to find ways to folks who have, courses. Probably the biggest question I get as families go, start going down this rabbit hole is they start asking questions about work. Like, oh my gosh, my work is taking up 50 hours a week and it's getting harder. So what do we do there? So I coach a lot of families if they want to transition, start building assets through a thing called Family Inc. And a lot of it's just to practice that teamness, but also practice it in a very productive way. Like, let's build a side asset or a side hustle or a business, So those are a few things that we're doing to try to encourage families as they're making this transition.
I love it. I love it. And it's all under that umbrella of the mission that you've claimed as a family. And I just think, obviously you're seeing a lot of traction, gaining traction with your ministry, and there's reasons for it. The hunger is there, the need is there. And I think people are going to be responding more and more. So hopefully we can send some people your way, and people's lives and families can be changed by what they experience with you and your ministry and your resources. We'll have all the links to what you've mentioned to your social media platforms, as well as your online resources in the episode description. So if you're watching or listening right now, I'm so thankful that y'all are here with us and that you've experienced Jeremy Pryor and his ministry. And if you're in the Houston area, just keep your eyes and ears open for those family teams weekends that are coming up, or at least one of them, maybe more, in the Houston area at the Story Church. We'd love to have you. And of course, I want to remind you one more time to subscribe to the channel. And if you have comments to share with us, don't hesitate. Don't be afraid of that comment section. We'll respond and have a good conversation in that way. So, Jeremy, thank you so much for being with us today. And I can't wait to see you here in Houston very soon, I hope.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, my pleasure. This is great.
All right. Bless you.